Eamon, there was a statement made today outside the courts by members of the Hutch family, Vera Hutch, in actual fact, the mother of Gareth Hutch, who was killed as part of the feud, as the fourth individual was sentenced to life in prison for his murder.
Well, there was two statements made. There was one that was read out in court
Right.
by one of the detectives involved in the case, which was much lengthier. But I think the one that, but she just spoke from her heart, I guess,
Mm.
outside the court. It wasn't a scripted one, and it was very basic. But you get the real sense of loss that the family have felt, over this a murder nearly 9 years ago now, 8 years ago in May 2016. And she just describes her son Gareth as a good fella. He worked. He didn't mind anyone. He adored his son. His little fella misses him. I won't bring him back, but we got justice for him today. And she finishes off with, "It's all over. It's all over now." I mean, it's a very,
Yeah.
it's, I suppose, how do you express in words, such a devastating loss for any family to have gone through. I mean, we know this one.
It's coming up on 8 years ago now at this stage.
Yeah, it was May 2016, I think it was, and it would have been the seventh of, what is it, 18 murders that are part of that feud. So it was very early on. Like, Gareth would have been one of the family members that would have shouldered Eddie Hutch's coffin, which was one of the really early murders, but that was the really shocking one because it was seen as, this is a man being killed because of his surname, as opposed to having anything to do with criminality. And again, then, Gareth was living in fear at this stage. We know this because Niall Ring, the Dublin City Councillor at the time, he had spoken about having spoken to him the day before and trying to help him draft a letter to the housing authorities to get him moved from where he was in Avondale House in Cumberland Street, which is where he ended up being murdered. So, there was a real, that sense of heightened tension that we could have kind of forgotten about, was there. And I think that came out with the way Vera spoke, after court today. I mean, it was very much a heartfelt thing. And you realise what's left behind. I know that it's headlines for us at the time. The monk's nephew shot dead, latest feud murder. But then there's this a devastating impact which doesn't go away, and I'm sure doesn't get any easier for families as the years go on.
For sure. Now, Nicky McConnell, firstly, Johnny Keogh, Thomas Fox, and Regina Keogh have already been convicted of the murder. But Nicky McConnell went on the run, didn't he? And he was found, or extradited at least, back from Turkey. And when he returned, he did challenge aspects of the case that delayed it for a long time. It was in the Supreme Court where there was rulings given around phone data and CCTV and the usage of those. Because, of course, in the case of Johnny Keogh, who was the other gunman, there was evidence given by a woman called Mary MacDonald, who was a neighbour of Gareth Hutch's, who had basically allowed her apartment be used as a watch, as a lookout. And she had given evidence in relation to Johnny Keogh coming into the apartment, etc. But her evidence wasn't used in the case of Nicky McConnell. So they were relying on that other stuff.
Yeah, like Judge Owens, I mean, he said that in December when McConnell was found guilty in the Special Criminal Court. He said, we're not relying on McDonald's ID evidence because she couldn't be sure when she was shown footage of him taken from a shop. And she said she couldn't be sure it was him. And he said, we're not relying on that anyway. And it was down to one of the key parts was the mobile phone traffic, and that they were able to put him in touch with the other conspirators, and also, of course, Jonathan Keogh, the man who pulled the trigger. I mean, it was interesting, I suppose, even, the fact that, Nicky McConnell, didn't release the safety catch on his gun, but he's still convicted of murder. He didn't fire any of the shots, but he was part and parcel of the enterprise, the joint enterprise to murder Gareth Hutch. So he's still convicted. He got his life sentence. I suppose the only upside for him is that it's backdated to when he was arrested in Turkey in 2020. So he's already 4 years into a life sentence, which these days is averaging at about 22 years. We've kind of yet to see the new parole board, how that's gonna work out. Kind of, they've changed the rules over when people can apply for release on license as a lifer, because as a lifer you're never free. And it wasn't that long ago people were sometimes getting out after 10 or 12 years, but that has crept up, ever since that. So, but in terms of like the evidence, that was kind of a crucial thing, and they had to wait, wasn't it? The whole Graham Dwyer case really that it was hinging on, and that was being fought through, and McConnell's lawyers were basically, I suppose, hoping for a result in that would get rid of
hitching their wagon to that.
Yeah, and would have been another kind of leg of evidence that was stacked up against their client, and if that was gone, then he possibly could have been in the clear.
It was interesting, the stuff around that safety catch on the gun, because his gun didn't fire, basically. Johnny Kyo's gun did, and released the bullets that fatally killed Gareth Hutch. But there was no kind of, it wasn't worked out whether he didn't release that on purpose or whatever. But I think the court ruled that other evidence around his activities, including the fact that they believed that he drove a BMW car, which was to be used as a getaway to nearby Avondale House. He was the one who drove that car there, and his DNA was found on a petrol can in that car. There was 2 sets of clothing found. Of course, that car didn't work when they tried to make their getaway. But
they had to make their way to a more reliable Skoda, which Nicky McConnell had also put in place as well.
He put the two. But in other words, that didn't, it was kind of like, as usual, you have a number of things that point to the fact that he was part of this murder plan.
Look, I mean, there was no getting away from it that he was part and parcel. I mean, while the ID evidence wasn't good, there was no real doubt that it was him with Jonathan Kyo at that time. There was all the previous linkages, moving the car, DNA being found on the car. I mean, and whether or not the safety catch was released, there's no evidence to show that, as you say, it wasn't done on purpose or not. I mean, he could have just been an incompetent gunman. I mean, he has, quite the record as a gangman thug, one of these kind of, I suppose, dissident Republican stroke crime gangs that were involved in extortion. Like, we know at one point he was providing, I think, he was one of these bodyguards for Jim Mansfield Jr. He was part of all that murkiness going on out there at the time in 2015. So, like, I mean, whether or not he was an incompetent criminal or not, I suppose he could try and argue that, but obviously it didn't work, or if he was deliberately trying to avoid, conviction by not turning on or releasing the safety catch. We're not going to know that now at this stage,
Vera Hutch made her statement today and made it very clear, really, the loss to a family of a son. It's 8 years gone. I think Gareth was 35 when he was killed. No doubt his son has become a teenager and is on his way to becoming an adult without a father all those years. But she suffered other losses too. I mean, certainly in the aftermath of Gareth Hutch's murder, her other son, Jonathan, survived an assassination attempt in Mallorca, during which an innocent man, Trevor O'Neill, was shot dead in front of his family. And later, her husband, Johnny Hutch, there was never total clarity on this, but he certainly suspected that a gunman believed to have been Nicky McConnell came to his door of a place he was staying in Turkey. He got so frightened by what he believed he saw at the door that he jumped from the balcony and broke his legs, or certainly one leg. And as the years went on, he became really stressed. I mean, they were living under an enormous amount of stress. And Johnny Hutch eventually, tragically, had an accident at home. I think he fell down the stairs and he died. Now, I know that some members of the wider Hutch family would actually also blame the Kinahans on that. They believed that he was sort of, I suppose the last few years of his life were really coloured by grief and by fear. That they were coming for other members of the family and indeed himself.
Yeah, I'm sure they were in that position where they didn't know who they could trust. I'm sure there was, when you look at so many people that would have been, I suppose part and parcel of the Hutch criminal network who swapped sides or, went with the Kinahan feud, then there would have been worries about, are people locally, are they under pressure? Are they being threatened? Are they going to take some money? Are they going to, to set someone up? And, when someone like Johnny Hutch is, fearing someone's trying to kill him in Turkey, it's going to be probably worse when he's at home in the north in the city. And I suppose Vera kind of touched on it in the statement that was read out in court, that she described, Gareth as being, and Johnny were best friends as well as, son and father. Um, and that he was just, I think the phrase was read out was like, he was heartbroken beyond repair. He'd lost his son and his best friend. So, I mean, there is that kind of never ending grief, it's an open wound. And he took that to the grave. So he never got to see, I suppose, the kind of the final chapter in justice being done. I mean, you can argue that it still isn't justice being done. Like, there's 4 people behind bars serving life, but ultimately someone else ordered this murder. Someone else kind of dangled the carrot. I know.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's an element of justice has been served. I suppose the other side of it as well is that, there's one of the senior guards involved in the investigation came out as well. Detective Superintendent Colin Murphy, he spoke after it as well, and he was appreciative of the cooperation from people in the north in the city, and I suppose that they want to show that they're there for everybody, and that it's not just about policing people who mightn't have that it's just because you have a relative who may or may not be part of a crime gang doesn't mean you're going to get any less treatment from the guards. And I think that was an important point for them to prove as well. And it's it has been a long dogged case, and this was coming at the time when it was one of 18 murders, and they weren't all in the north in the city, but there was a lot going on in that space of time between murder investigations and attempted murder investigations and trying to foil some of these. And we've granted all these before, the various kind of hit squads that were caught in the act, where they were carrying out surveillance.
There's been loads of trials, all of which have been before the Special Criminal Court. Just as we're talking there, I'm trying to consider, is there more before the courts now, or is that the last? Because while the murder of Eddie Hutch is still under investigation, nobody has actually been charged in relation to that. And I can't think of any of the other feud murders that there are still outstanding trials.
Well, I mean, you still have Duckhead Queeran. I mean, don't forget, you have
if Sean McGovern is ever brought back.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's. I know there's constantly all these headlines. The net is tightening and time is running out for the Kenahans in Dubai. But I do think at some point down the line that it's likely to happen, and whether it's going to be in the next 6 weeks, 6 months, or 16 years, we just don't know. And I imagine that there's a big effort going on with the DPP and the guards to future-proof any case like this, knowing that this could be 10 years before we get to, somebody gets up in a witness box to say, to give their evidence. But I doubt it's ever going to be let go, unless somebody, is killed or dies in the meantime. These cases are still live, and there are others, of course, as well.
Yeah. Now, speaking of the DPP, another story that's sort of in the ether at the moment, the Irish Times had actually written a piece about that the DPP is considering new charges to be levelled against Gerry The Monk Hutch in relation to Garda corruption. Now, this is part of this very large Garda corruption investigation, which is underway. Of course, when Gerry Hutch was arrested in September of 2021 in Spain and was brought back to Ireland, put into custody as we awaited the Regency trial. Kind of in the aftermath of that, there was a raid on the home of John Spud Murphy, a former Garda superintendent, former head of the Garda traffic unit, and somebody who was suspected of feeding information to the Hutch organisation and possibly to Gerry Hutch himself. Now, that all kind of related to the fact that there was a warrant issued for Gerry Hutch's arrest some months before he was ever caught, that they had eyes on him coming from Lanzarote and were due to arrest him, and he kind of went to ground. And it subsequently emerged that it had been leaked that this European arrest warrant was in existence for him. Funnily, Hutch, during the podcast with us there late last year for the election, he actually, spoke around that. And he said that he really was always going to hand himself over. He just wasn't going to come back here to sit in custody for a protracted length of time as the trial was pending. But of course, he was caught, which undid that plan. But nonetheless, this investigation, so they raided Spud Murphy's house, and there they found more than 250 grand's worth of cannabis, which I think everybody was surprised by. He very quickly pleaded guilty, was given 6.5 years and remains in prison. But around all that, there's a number of suspensions of serving Gardaí. There is a suspicion that he acted as a conduit to pass sensitive information into criminal organisations, not just the Hutch organisation, but other criminal gangs. Obviously, he's been investigated for that during the period of time he was a serving officer and in the aftermath. So that leaves an interesting situation where this file has been submitted to the DPP, and the suggestion is that there may be charges levelled against Hutch himself. Now, are those charges in relation to corruption, taking corrupt information, or is this where they look at the possibility of charging him for directing a criminal organisation? A charge which has been, put before Patrick Keating, for example, and Barry Young have both pleaded to that charge, pleaded guilty, and both are serving around 10 years in prison in relation to it. Is it a crime to actually get information? Do you know if it's coming from, corruptly?
I think under that particular legislation now, that anything you do that aids or helps a criminal gang is an offence. And that any help you give.
But to actually get it, So well, it'd be a criminal offence, obviously, for a guard to pass on information like that. But on the other end of it, is there a big burden of proof to prove that an individual either paid for that information or sought it or asked for it?
I don't think it's even a question of asking for it. But if you have somebody who innocently, say, passes on information to, a middle person who then passes it on to the criminal mastermind or whatever, I mean, whether they like it or not, they are now in the position where they can be accused of aiding and, providing assistance to a criminal gang. Because I don't think ignorance of where the information was going is a defence. I mean, you can't say, well, I didn't realise the shotgun that I passed on to somebody was going to be used in a murder. I thought he was going to shoot ducks, even though the guy doesn't have a gun licence and you were doing it in the dark at night. So it's always a possibility. It's always a possibility that if you're committing an offence, which it is for a guard to pass on, secret information to anybody, whether it's a journalist or a criminal, it's a straightforward offence if it can be proved. On the other hand, like in terms of if somebody's been charged with helping to run an organised crime gang, I mean, that's a kind of a different issue possibly for Gerry Hutch that he might have to face. I mean, his cab case years ago, and again, it's ancient history in one sense, like he was described as running a criminal organisation. And I suppose you'd have to kind of look carefully at the comments from the Special Criminal Court in the Regency murder trial for which he was acquitted. We'll have to, you can look at that where, it was very much accepted by the court in that case that, he was involved in this crime gang to a point where whether or not he stepped in afterwards to help them get rid of the guns, he was still part and parcel. And, is that enough to convict him?
And actually, it was like in the actual judgment, he was described as the head of the family. And I think subsequently he did apply to the courts to, because he obviously paid for his own legal, his own legal team and solicitors, etc., for that case. And I think he made an application at one point to the same court to see if he could apply for his money that cost him. And during that application, the same judge, Tara Burns, suggested that nothing happened within the Hutch organisation without his say-so, which is going one step further, really, to suggest that he is the leader. But from my memory, during the court case, the evidence given by Superintendent David Gallagher of the Drugs and Organised Crime Bureau, there was sort of loose evidence given around the existence of the Hutch Organised Crime Group. But at no point during that evidence was Hutch actually listed as being the leader of it. That's not to say there can't be a case taken. I would just feel the state would be very reluctant to go for Hutch again, given the disaster and fiasco. And, we've never even got near working out how much state money was spent on that Regency and the previous Regency trial where his nephew, Patrick Hutch, Jr. also was acquitted. Essentially, a null prosequi was entered in that case. How much those trials have cost, I think...
Yeah, well, the DPP have got a bloody nose, certainly, when it came to Gerry Hutch and the Regency murder trial. Whether or not that makes them think twice about going again is anyone's guess. I mean, it would have to be a special criminal court again, so it's going to be, as you say, another expensive day, a couple of weeks in court if they do go for that. I mean, even if you listen to, when he was speaking to yourself and Niall, I mean, he very much, spoke in the past tense, in terms of any criminality, and that he put forward, from his point of view, that he was dragged into this very much as a mediator, and he was trying to help family members get out from under the thumb of the Kinahan organised crime gang, and that he was simply somebody who had standing and status in his community, and somebody who's seen as an honest broker. And you can argue that this is being borne out by the number of votes he got in the recent election. You can argue again whether standing for election might kind of stiffen the resolve of the DPP to go after him or not, or whether that's even a consideration. So
yeah,
it's kind of, in a way, it's there to play for. If I was going to bet, I don't think it'll happen, and I think it won't happen for the simple reason that, as you say, they had bigger, more solid cases, and they didn't win them.
At the same time, the NBCI have been investigating this corruption case for quite a number of years. We know that some sort of both phone and laptop devices have been seized, and we know that there's a number of people suspended from duty. Perhaps they have discovered or found, that, I suppose, that solid evidence that's needed. Yeah. I mean, certainly by sending a file to the DPP, they believe they have evidence enough to charge him with something. And that has to be directing a criminal gang, because how could you charge somebody with receiving information if that isn't an actual existing crime? But maybe it is under the laws, certainly they're looking at for the corruption. I think that would be a very hard case to prove. You'd have to prove that somebody paid for the information, or...
Yeah, we don't know what's in the DPP or the file that's gone to the DPP. So, I mean, as you say, we don't know if there is new evidence, or if there's strong new evidence, or if there's new statements and new witnesses. I mean, the problem with any kind of corruption case, regardless of its nature, whether it's, business corruption or criminal corruption, it usually involves kind of two people. And it's in both people's interest not to admit it. And it makes it very hard to prove corruption if somebody is, I don't know, selling, passports, or stamping passport forms for you, or giving you the right forms signed to get your driver's license so you can open up bank accounts. All of that kind of stuff is very hard to prove, because it's an unspoken crime in a sense, and both sides are benefiting from it. I mean, the victim is whoever ends up being the eventual victim of the corruption. But the corruption itself, it's a notoriously difficult criminal offence to prove.
Absolutely. Now, undoubtedly, that the investigation, given that it's been suggested that the file has gone to the DPP in relation to Hutch, directing a criminal organisation and receiving this corrupt information, it would look as if there's charges probably pending for Spud Murphy. Now, he was released recently on temporary release, and part of his release, he wasn't allowed anywhere near a public house and was found to have been in a pub. And when he went back, he's been put back into the main prison population again. But he is nearing the end of his sentence. And it looks like maybe there might be something more for him in the future.
Yeah, and we know it wasn't... Gerry Hutch was arrested while he was on remand as well before the Regency trial, and questioned about this investigation into corruption as well. And of course, then he has the whole money laundering case against him in Lanzarote as well. Although he seems pretty confident that there's nothing to that as far as he's concerned. I think the information there from the Spanish side is that he is somehow using these properties to launder ill-gotten gains, but he doesn't seem to think there's much of a case to answer. And quite possibly the Spanish authorities don't either, if they're allowing him to leave the country on a bond of 100,000. So, and the speculation or the kind of the piece that was in the Irish Times today as well suggests that there's no connection between the two. So it's unlikely there's any link, I guess, between that and the corruption charge. Well, there wouldn't be anyway. I mean, they're completely different nature of charges anyway.
Well, I suppose it remains to be seen what happens with Gerry Hutch. He's still, I think the nation is still sort of reeling after his near election success. I actually still, anybody who stops me asks me about it. Imagine he nearly got elected. Imagine it's actually not abated, the interest in him, and the fact that, you know, that election campaign was almost successful. But we wait and see what comes. But in the meantime, I suppose, you know, our sympathies with Vera Hutch, the mother of Gareth, who made those comments outside the court. Thanks, Eamon.
Always a pleasure, Nicola.
Robbie Lawler was out of control.
This is Double Cross, the murder of Robbie Lawler.
It was going to be an all-out war with him in the middle of it.
A Crime World special investigation podcast based on my new book, Web of Betrayal, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.